nicely to Martin in the sense of that I'm also asking about the relationship of the law and power, but I bring in another term which would be justice. And I'm doing that also on the background of Jacques Derrida, whose whole considerations about the sovereign and the beast are referring to the question of the law being intertwined with this question of violence, are based on the ground of violence, and that justice is made impossible if you only refer to the law or the legal question. So you need another setting to get justice into view. So what I would like to reflect on Ines Dujard's sculpture, No Dress for Conquering, as haunted by and as in alliance with, but also as challenging, Derrida's text, The Beast and the Sovereign. I would like to suggest that something significant happens when the sculpture's triple of figures supplements Derrida's couple. It is not only that a figure of female political agency enters the stage, but that virtual sexual differences, and this is a term that Derrida uses in plural, sexual differences, not sexual difference, undermine a politics built upon the dual beast and is sovereign. Thus, my particular interest lies in discovering how, actually, and under which conditions, Ines Dujard's sculpture develops an agency against socio-historical and geopolitical relations of domination and violence. And this is also talking about art and aesthetic questions, because art is not simply expressing a historical situation, it is actually intervening into the situation. Wow, and this is a question of aesthetic decisions. So I will try to explain why, for this matter, it is important to understand the sculpture in 3 dimensions, and this is as a speech act, as a sexual act, and as a fantasy scenario. In order to acknowledge this as politics, one needs to consider a dynamic interplay between speech, sexuality, and fantasy. And I would go so far that I say that any critical talk about censorship needs to claim an imaginary domain where fantasy may run wild, while not separating fantasy from sexual speech and speaking violence. So I have 3 parts. The first part looks at the couple and the triple and non-binary female with a star, kind of denaturalizing the female sexual political agency. By Derrida's text, The Beast and the Sovereign engages with a couple. In fact, it questions this couple, the sovereign and the beast, or the sovereign is the beast. Dujard's sculpture, No Dress for Conquering, presents a triple: the sovereign, the mining woman, and the beast. For Derrida, and is remains undecided and undecidable. As much as the beast and the sovereign are juxtaposed as 2 radically heterogeneous species, they are also, and this is quotes now, they are also a communitarian attachment, a couple, a double, a narcissistic resemblance, a becoming beast of the sovereign and a becoming sovereign of the beast. Both at a distance to the law, the beast ignorant of the right and the sovereign having the right to suspend the right. End of the quote. So what if there's a mining woman, a woman worker, a care worker, a producer of subjects, objects and culture who is claiming right to food, right to shelter, dignity, right to sexual self-determination, while being equally at a distance to the law? What if the positions of ignorance and suspension of the sovereign and the beast are both problematized because they are legitimizing violence? For Derrida, the undecidability means that an in-between unfolds, which is inhabited, and this is interesting with the sculptures, it's inhabited by wolves, going through all the lectures of Derrida, by wolves, by marionettes, and by centaurs, figures with a human and an animal part. But the law remains the common reference, and there's an endless back and forth between the sovereign making and suspending law and the beast ignoring the law. Only if a third option comes up, justice might have a chance. And this third option is what I see announced in Not Dressed for Conquering. Yet, it only evolves as an alternative if the mining woman does not enter the back and forth, but denounces sovereignty as the basis for political agency. Looking at Riyad's sculpture, we realize that the question about gender relations, which Derrida simultaneously introduced and dismissed through his formulation, and this is a quote, that in the place of the beast, one can put in the same hierarchy the slave, the woman, and the child. End of quote. With the sculpture, these gender relations become more complicated. Since the mining woman is positioned in the middle, between sovereign and beast, is riding the former and loosely held from the back by the latter, Derrida's relation, is suspended, if not subverted. If the woman is not the beast, but a figure in her own right, this also undermines the attribution beast feminine, sovereign masculine, which Derrida points out. Why not leave it undecided and undecidable, whether the beast is male, female, neither or both, or whether this doesn't matter? If the sovereign is male, female, neither or both, or it doesn't matter, and of course also, equally, if the mining woman is male, female, neither or both, or it doesn't matter. So I will go for the transgender they. The constellation of the figure suggests an anal sexual act. Yet again, it's undecided and undecidable. Is it the miner fucking the king while taking pleasure from the beast, from their beastliness? The posture of the miner could also be seen as them not penetrating, but riding the king, which does not mean that there's not fucking the king. But it opens up the possibility that the king is actually taken by the beast. We see...
I hope there is no lawyer in the room. To complicate our case.
We are talking about possibilities, actually. Okay, so, but to go back to the evidence, Derrida says there is no phallic eminence. See, there's no erection. Nevertheless, there are power relations going on. The middle figure is the only one wearing any costume, namely a warrior or a safety helmet, and it's equipped with a long, thick braid, a symbol of a future to be opened. I don't know, I read that in Wikipedia, that Zöpfe are about open futures. So the middle figure is the defining center around which power circulates, a gyroscope which enables and disrupts the relationship, the fraternity, between the other two. Another famous triple comes to mind. Oh. Friedrich Nietzsche has commissioned this photograph in Zurich in 1882. It depicts him and his friend Paul Reh at the handle of a wooden barrow, on which Andreas Salome is kneeling, swinging the whip at the back of her common friends. Even though her gesture looks rather reluctant, the guys when the guys are more interested in some unknown aim in faraway future, the center of activity is on the side of Lou. Female sexual political agency, which sets the condition of their relationship. The photo has been taken after she had already rejected them, both of them, asking for her hand. Instead, she told them that she were interested in cultivating their intellectual exchange. And it says she was actually suggesting them to move together, the three of them, in a shared flat. Reason enough for Nietzsche to envision this scenario and to put on stage the German saying, I don't know whether this translates, the German saying that she yokes them to their carriage. Sie spannt die Herren vor ihren Wagen. A male fantasy of female agency. Aesthetically, the photo does not create too much space for the whipping subject, nor does it substantially endanger the performance of masculinity. However, as historical agents, Lu Andreas Salome, as well as Domitila Barrios de Chungara, the feminist Bolivian revolutionary union worker who gave the inspiration for Duyak's middle figure, fought their respective cases powerfully. Since Domitila Chungara was a decisive figure in, Ines said that yesterday, in ending the Banzer dictatorship in Bolivia in 1978, it is perhaps not surprising that Duyak's sculpture, Domitila is symbolically riding the king. We go back to the sculpture, I guess. Whoops. So, not surprising that Domitila is riding the king. In an ironical play with the equestrian monument, also dem klassischen Reiterdenkmal, epitome of sovereignty, Duyak puts Domitila in a position of the potentate while the king is on his knees. Yet opposed to this, the whole constellation is placed on a hand barrel, reminders of centuries of colonial and capitalist exploitation, which makes people like Domitila live in cardboard shacks and actually die in poverty. While I have not even touched on the remnants of the fascist history, which provide a further ground layer of the sculpture, this contradictory setting of her being in a position of agency, but nevertheless placed on this historical ground of violence, provokes the question of sovereignty. Is organizing a hunger strike, as Domitila did together with 4 other mining women, an act of sovereignty or a challenge to sovereignty, or both? Does it put her simultaneously in an intimate relation with the beast? The beast, don't need Derrida to know that, the beast most often symbolizing the savage. Is there a complicity between them when the beast is fucking the king? Or do we face a scandalous, and this is really kind of like different readings that are made possible by the sculpture? Or do we face a scandalous and defaming moment of the sculpture if she is fucked by the beast? By the famous beast of fascist history, the German shepherd's dog, the species employed not only as guards, but actually in killers in the Nazi concentration camps. I would prefer them reading the constellation as the beast fucking Juan Carlos, who became king due to the patronage of Franco. His monarchy indeed built on a fascist history, as his deal hand suggests. The king being taken by the shepherd's dog, swallowing, vomiting a bunch of another symbol, fascist cornflowers, staging all the ambivalence that Juan Carlos embodied and enacted when he, despite of his careful education in Franquist military academies, did not pursue his task as it was expected, but installed a parliamentary democracy. So I think there is this ambivalent stage in this figure, like the vomiting flower and the beast potentially fucking. This does not put Domitila in a position of the sovereign actor or a hero facing the enemy. She is in touch with and touched by history. Also, if we claim her, or even if we claim her for her a third position, even then, if we read the writing warrior, the Amazon, as the emblem of lesbian subjectivity, as we might like to do, thinking of Hélène Cixous's Promethea or of Elspeth Probin's chapter on women and horses, or in taking Monique Wittig's thesis that the lesbian is not a woman as opening up a third space beyond heteronormativity for sexual political agency. Which brings me to the headline of my speech, where I argue that between the speech act and the sexual act, we also have this moment of undecidability. So the speech act might be the sex act and the other way around. Hildegard Amanshauser, in her review, and I think it's one of the very few reviews that actually engaged and honored Ines' sculpture after the Magba thing going on. In her review writes that Duyak's sculpture does not represent a sexual act, but a speech act. I fuck you, it says, according to Amanshauser, and it does so through the body language of Domitila Barrios de Chungara, while the king is vomiting flowers and the dog Wolf is spaced out. Two objections from my side, even though I really recommend this review. Two objections from my side. One, is there such a clear-cut distinction? What if the speech act is a sexual act? Not necessarily one that does exactly what it says, but nevertheless an act which constitutes a speaker and or its addressees as sexual beings. She is the active one, Amanshauser right, when she says, I fuck you. Yet the power of this announcement is not exclusively on the side of the speaking body. A speech act is always a collective act. Now there's Butler in the background. Many voices are speaking even when they are emanating from a single body. The speech act gains authority through quoting from sedimentations of historical usage, more often than not, a history of violence. When the announcement, I fuck you, is not a promise, but a threat, which furthermore carries with it a long tradition of defamation and repeats the stereotypes of inferior sexual passivity. And this is what it has to play on. If it wants to be defaming or caricature, there is this image that passivity is inferior. Then it is really difficult to break the spell of history through inverting the positions. And you were pointing to that yesterday. In a way, one could then say that Lou Andreas Salome's I won't fuck you seems more radical, since it claims an active non-activity, which subverts the established gender positions, all of them. While I would argue that also in the case of Not Dressed for Conquering, the triple implies more than a simple inversion, I am still skeptical whether the widespread reception of the sculpture as a submission and disempowerment actually has the potential to, or undermines the potential to overcome centuries of moralistic sexual scandalization which always have been used to denigrate the enemy. Therefore, I have a suggestion, namely another speech act. An act that I think would be more adequate to the historical and political context that the sculpture opens, which would be the speech act, kiss my arse. Leck mich am Arsch. Instead of claiming a position of sovereignty, as in I fuck you, where the active I, made for conquering, is on stage, Kiss My Ass invites the addressee into activity. And it does so by claiming for oneself the position of pleasurable devotion or devotion to one's own pleasure and well-being. Kiss My Ass is if spoken from a less powerful position, as we have it here, still claims the force to call the powerful into submission. Either in the very extreme sense of, that's also a way of translating it, of sei ein Arschkriecher. I don't know to whom this is addressed. In the more generous sense of submitting to the erotic wishes of other, kiss my ass, or also in the sense of an action which accepts not to act. Kiss my ass can also mean leave me alone, fuck off if you don't find pleasure in giving me pleasure. All these options do actually sound quite interesting for a context asking about decolonizing politics and overcoming fascist and imperialist legends. So considering the triple constellation of New York sculpture, Kiss My Ass, spoken from the middle position, would practically require that the sovereign gives up on its oral vomiting relation with the fascist cornflowers, and that the beast would need to step from fantasy into action or not action. Okay, so the king gives up on the vomiting and the beast gives up on, steps from fantasy to action. Then the speech act would indeed make itself readable as a collective, an unintentionally shared embodied practice which would step down from a politics of sovereignty. And it was interesting that Ines was saying yesterday that she actually wants to read the sculpture not as three different figures, but as one figure. I think that would be nice to think about this a bit longer. A sexual act can be a speech act. It can be a way of claiming one's mastery and superiority. It can be an act of submission or domination or degradation, but also an expression of compassion or love or care. A speech act can be a sexual act. It can work as a seduction, as a caress of the body, an eroticization, or a passionate, ecstatic delirium. In their intertwinement, the sexual act and the speaking sexual contribute to constituting or denying or degrading sexual subjectivity and sexual embodiments. Yet to actually develop an embodied sexual subjectivity needs more than speech acts and sexual acts or sexual practices. It needs what Drusilla Cornell, a legal theorist and feminist, calls the sanctuary of the imaginary domain. And there I come to my third and last part. There is no sexuality without fantasy. And while it probably originates unconsciously through the interplay of interdependent bodies, it needs an imaginary domain for the sexual being to develop and to experiment with adequate self-representations of one's sexual being, and with the possibility of fantasy running wild in order to enable change. For Cornell, this imaginary domain is personal, but it is not a private matter. It is not enclosed in our minds, but it needs cultural support rather than restriction. While the state has no right to intervene into the imaginary domain, it has the responsibility to guarantee it and to support people through resources, through education, through culture, to make the best use of it. Unfortunately, the imaginary domain is not beyond history and power. It is pre-designed and limited by norms and habit and hegemonic imaginary, and heteronormativity. So art's role can consist in pushing the limits, in reworking its sedimented material and in combining its elements in unexpected ways. Art is one way of sharing one's fantasies, of creating articulations of personal, cultural, imaginary, and of offer them to the public or to public use. Museums and exhibition spaces, public, private, and also DIY, I would kind of like to get this into the discussion, may be understood as providing resources and regulating conditions, and they might also be policing, as Simon said yesterday, but there is a spectrum. So let's understand queer sculpture as a desire or a suggestion to imagine history and decolonizing or post-colonial politics as a sexual scenario. Juan Carlos, socialized by Franco's institutions into his masculinist, monarchistic self, shown nakedly as a vulnerable being, fucked by a fascist bestiality, but still obtaining his position as honorary president of the Organization of Ibero-American States, built on colonial heritage, as well as, very concretely, claiming the profits of royal wealth and a remarkable annual salary financed by neo-colonial exploitation and the taxes of a debt-ridden state economy. So when imagination is turned into an artwork and publicly displayed, me, as part of the audience, I am implicated in the scenario, and I'm addressed as a sexual and a political being myself. This is a moment, I would argue, when the question of securing or transforming power relations become relevant. And this is a connection to Martin's talk before. While anything is possible in the imaginary domain, imagination is the format of trying out all kinds of deathly, aggressive, perversely pleasurable, or boring fantasies. One cannot abstract from fantasy becoming speech act, thus taking a role within existing power relations. As a speech act, it enters the sphere of social responsibility. And social responsibility, for me, is overlapping with the law, but it's definitely not kind of like formed or designed by the law. Concerning not dress for conquering, for me this provokes a question, yes, more or less time. Concerning not dress for conquering, for me this provokes a question whether the figures involved in the scenario, particularly since they are readable and are supposed to be read as actual historical persons, have a chance to consent, to talk back, to negotiate the conditions under which they are involved or implied in the public display of a sexual fantasy scenario. Which powers are backing them? And can they fall back on a reservoir of publicly available self-representations of their sexual being, which might function, if wished for, as counter-images? And this is Drusilla Cordell, who says to develop a sexual being needs sexual self-representations. It's not something that you live for yourself in a private sphere, but the question is, what are the conditions to actually express yourself? And there she is liberal. You alone are the controlling person of this sexual self-representation, as long as it's not violating somebody else. And here we have this question of privacy, rights, and rights to artistic freedom as inattention, as Martin pointed out. And we can ask, is this individual rights or is this kind of like collective values, and how we negotiate these power relations? So if we ask this in the case of Juan Carlos, one might very well argue that he has all the power of the sovereign to defend his image. There are people who are stepping in for that. While in the case of Domitila Valls de Chongara, her disadvantages are being female, being socialist, and being poor. Who are the forces who defend her against the powers of a history of symbolic violence, which, as Derrida points out, for centuries equate the woman, the slave, and the beast. So we have a history of stereotypes, and the aesthetic, artistic question is, how are they reworked, and who is engaging in the debate of this, whether this works or not. Domitila, and that is for me one of the tricky points. Domitila was still alive when the sculpture was first considered to be shown in La Paz, in Brazil, in Bolivia. So what would it have meant for her to find her political case represented in Dujard's sculpture? And this is a question of personality rights, but also of power relations. So concerning the censorship debate, we have to discuss censorship securing power, but we also have to consider demands that aim at undermining power. And this is not the legal question of state censorship that I'm now referring to. It does make a difference whether the demand to avoid a certain practice is issued from a hegemonic or disempowered position. Take, for example, this is another example, take the use of the N-word, and consider whether someone is in the position to relinquish the use of the N-word from their own privileged vocabulary, or whether someone has to beg not to be exposed again and again to its hurtful enunciation. You may very well argue for the critical repetition of a racist stereotype in order to deconstruct or rework it. But one wants to understand how the critique makes itself known and who is able to understand it. Or if you want to open a morally controversial issue, one actually has to face a double challenge of explaining how moral judgments either feed into and support or challenge social hierarchies, but also how power inequalities predefine the context of potential negotiation. And this is, of course, concerning the question of sexuality and queer and dissident and perverse sexuality is a very important question of who has the possibility to represent her sexual being, speaking from which position, and where is the power to actually activate moralities that can silence something. So, my last sentence. No call neither for nor against censorship without a self-reflexive power analysis. If we are envisioning a politics of justice, we cannot refer to sovereign law, nor can we rely on the state. Instead, we have to trust in complex power analysis and in collective practices, which aim at destabilizing rigid norms and de-hierarchizing relations of inequality. So it is conflict and contingency and not censorship which would provide for the politics of an open future. Thank you.
Questions? Questions or soup?
Thank you so much, Antke, for your well-elaborated argument on this culture. And like hearing the whole discussion that we've been having yesterday and today, I think that probably now most of the artists that are here in the audience are thinking, I wish my work could be censored. So we can actually, discuss so deeply. Because honestly, some of the questions that you are actually raising right now are the questions that we, the curators, and now Valentin is not here anymore because he left, but that actually we had in mind when choosing this piece for the Beast and the Souverän. From the very beginning, of course, it was like, as soon as we saw the sculpture, we said like, oh, what, this is so funny. This is like a pun on the Beast and the Souverän. But of course, from the beginning, we thought, it's very interesting, because there is the Beast, the Souverän, and something else, right? So that basically like that's the whole couple, this binary, this dualism kind of destabilized from the very beginning. And yes, thank you so much for your insights, your comments.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you said that yesterday, like, we actually want to think about why does an artwork make us feel uncomfortable, and I think this creative space, which does not fit into this very, very well-established sovereign beast binary, is just one thing in itself. And then I also think that I mean, that was the other part that I tried to do, is kind of like to say it accomplishes something, but this that we do feel uncomfortable is also that the question of how we actually analyze and map the power relations might be very difficult different from the very different positions we are speaking from. So if showing the piece kind of like also has the effect of opening the space for a critique that says, okay, there is an appropriation of Mitilla as a historical figure. I think that has to be taken seriously, kind of like also as something which subverts some of the power shifts that it accomplishes from another kind of like side, not in the sense of two sides, but of many sides. And I think that's something that for me, maybe the term censorship is not the right term, but I find it important to open up this whole space about hate speech and vulnerability also as something which does not have to be closed, which does not provide final answers, but which is exactly the space where you can ask, okay, a discomfort or even a feeling of hurt can be the entering point for a collective reading and a collective shift of the power relations involved in the perception of the artwork.
When there are no more questions, we will install now the soup. You take the soup, you try to eat quick. And we prepare your presentation, okay?